Okay, first, let's try to understand what's wrong with the large reactors. Why are people not making as many of those anymore? Uh, okay, well, the first reason has to do with its ability to meet the competitiveness requirement of economics, the first hurdle. Let's take a look. Next slide. Now, the first reactors in the United States that were dedicated to power were not that large. In fact, they were all small. They might not have been modular, but they were all small. What's small? Well, it's been a sort of a work of sort of an interpretation of art at the Department of Energy, but they've coalesced around the argument that anything up to like 10 megawatts electrical is a micro reactor, and anything around you know from that level to let's say 300 megawatts electrical in capacity would be a small reactor. To give you some idea, the largest reactor right now, I think, is the French EDF machine, and I want to say it's 1650 megawatts electrical. That's pretty big. Many of the reactors in the States are 800 megawatts to 1200 megawatts. The latest one to come online at Vogtle is 1200. So a small reactor, is smaller than that. And yet, I think until the late 60s, the reactors that were online almost everywhere in the world were all under 300 megawatts, at or under. So we have already experienced a generation of reactors that were small. They weren't modular. They may not have been advanced, whatever that means, but they sure as heck were small. What happened is, uh, let's see, I'm older than you guys. Do we have anybody here who's at least 60 years old? Anybody? No, no show of hands. Oh boy. All right. Well, let me tell you something. When I first flew as a child, the first plane I flew on was a DC 3. DC 3 had two propellers. It didn't have room for many, many people. And they quickly learned that they could make a lot more money if they made a bigger plane and they had a more efficient engine, and they have jetliners. I don't know how many seats are on a 757. Can someone Google that? 757. How many seats does it have?
Boeing 757 can seat 200 to 300 passengers, depending on the
Okay.
configuration.
And look up DC 3. How many seats on a DC 3?
21 to 28.
Yep.
There you go. So that's an order of magnitude. Now, why did they move to a larger number of seats? Because the cost of carrying each of those passengers did not grow arithmetically, but uh, with the number. In other words, you made the plane bigger. Yeah, it costs more, but you made so much more money that it paid to make the plane bigger. That's called an example of an economy of scale. That the cost to take an extra passenger actually is marginally less than the unit that you're adding, and so it pays to go larger. Now, here is a curve of a I don't know why they call it minimally efficient scale, but it roughly points out that the economics of scale um, essentially. I want to make sure that the cost per unit. Well, the cost per unit goes down as you get larger until you make something so large it's an engineering feat to make it that large, and then it gets to be uneconomic. So you're looking for that sweet spot, okay? And you'll notice that proposals to make planes bigger than 2 or 300 always run into problems. Any thoughts as to why? By the way, there are lots of answers. So you can take a couple of guesses and probably hit the pinata. Any thoughts? Why are planes not getting? They don't hold much more than 300.
Because probably the economics go down beyond that.
Well, why?
Aerodynamics, physics.
Yeah, that's one reason. And then, have you been to an airport recently?
Probably takes forever to get that many people on and off.
Yes, you got it. And so you see that aquamarine part of the it says diseconomics of scale. That's what happens when you go too big. All right. All right. Now, there are lots of different ways to approach economies of scale. The most obvious one in the case of a reactor that was small and costing a fair amount for each megawatt of electricity that it produced was to make the reactor bigger to make it produce more electricity, because the cost of making it bigger, like the plane, should drive down the costs per unit. It should, in other words, the small reactor of the 60s would be at the tip of that red curve, right? And if you made it larger, they hoped they would get at least constant returns to scale. That's sort of the purple part there. All right, so they went to several hundred megawatts to things that were almost a gigawatt, and yeah, the gigawatt thing cost more, but it didn't cost. If you went to let's say you went from a half gigawatt to 1 gigawatt. These figures are phony. It would cost a fair amount just to go to a half gigawatt, but to go to a full gigawatt might not cost marginally that much more. So you go to the larger machine. That's exactly what was done starting in the late 60s. Let's take a look. However, what didn't happen and hasn't happened by going larger is a reduction in the cost of the product, the unit product, which is, a megawatt of electricity. In this case, it's measured in kilowatts. You just take a zero off. Here is a chart that is, somewhat dated, and I try to update it, showing the capital construction costs of reactors most recently that are large. Now, there is a concept, and we'll get into this again, so don't freak out. If you can ask questions about it, but we'll come back to it again when we get to the economics part of the class. There's something called an overnight cost versus a levelized cost. Does anybody know what an overnight cost is? Anybody here a finance wizard? It may not be. If there are no show of hands, no show of hands, no show of hands. Okay. Well, how many of you have bought a car on time or a house? Does anybody have a home mortgage? I mean, come on, there must be one person. There we go. All right. Do you have a 15 or 30-year note?
30-year.
30-year.
30-year. All right. Well, the total cost of that house, what the house, let's say, I don't know what it sold for. Let's say it sold for, I don't know, 450,000. The overnight costs of constructing that house and paying for it would be $450,000 roughly. That's the price you pay for a constructed house that you can move into. But the total cost of that house is not realized until the end of 30 years. My guess is that house will cost, I don't know, probably in excess of $2 million or something. I don't know. At 7%, but you're paying off, you're doubling the capital carrying costs every 10 years. So I mean, I don't know, it's some big number. Okay. Well, with capital construction costs being high for nuclear plants, one way they wanted to try to measure the costs is to say, well, imagine if we built the thing and overnight, and there were no, you didn't have to pay a loan while you were building it to keep building it, because it sometimes takes 10 years or more to build these plants. So let's imagine you could build it overnight. So these are overnight costs, which are totally oblivious to the costs of borrowing money, which right now is, you know, higher than it used to be. And instead of 2%, a non-conforming loan, I don't know, 7 or 8%, right? Serious interest rate compared to what it used to be. But if you take a look at this chart, these are various uh, reactors that are large. They're all a gigawatt or bigger. And, it'll show when they began and what their estimates were and how much they are as of, at least in this case, this is a dated chart, 2012, I suspect. And you'll notice that instead of learning or reducing, well, let's take two concepts. Instead of the costs going down per unit of electricity produced, the construction costs were such that even the overnight costs each year estimated forward were going up. The most extreme example is the most recent one, which is Vocal in Georgia, which started, uh, at an estimate where that red dot was, and was finally completed. And I think it was something like triple what the original estimate was. So somehow or another, things did not work out with regard to making things large. Now, there was also this idea, besides economies of scale, that if you kept making a product and made a lot of them, you would learn. You have a learning curve, and that you would learn how to make it more in a more efficient fashion. And there's lots of literature that suggests that you can reduce the cost of something if you build a lot of them because of the learning curve. So in addition to economies of scale, it was thought, well, if you make it bigger and you make a lot of them, the cost will come down. Well, this chart suggests uh, not a learning curve, but a forgetting curve. Something's happening here where things are getting more complicated and more costly over time. And the economies of scale are not positive, they're negative. I have to tell you, there are only a handful of fields where this is the case. This is one of them. Most other high tech areas do not look like this at all. They look like a reversal, a flip. They look like the opposite of this. Okay, now part of the drivers, you say, well, why did that happen? It's because if you take your time building something long enough, and you're not under pressures to get done, you figure out more things to do. Does anybody relate to that at all? Has anyone ever experienced a lack of a deadline and ending up exploiting that to make more work? It's never happened to any of you. You've never seen that. The hand goes up. Yeah, there you go. All right.
I believe the
Well,
phrase is tasks expand to fill the time they have to complete them.
there you go. Right. So you've got that, and it they we'll see something momentarily. The costs of building these things turned out to be greater than they imagined, and the reason why is when you change a design, you discover engineering problems. Never mind the NRC. I mean, everybody likes this fable that, well, it's the government's fault. Well, I'm sure that's part of it. But even if there was no government, the changes that were made to these designs is just unbelievable. You can see this in the defense sector when they try to design a plane while they're building it. And that usually ends up driving up the costs enormously. If you don't have a stable design, the costs go up. And then, of course, what we've experienced most recently is a lack of qualified labor. We'll get to that in a moment, but I think that's the least of it. In any case, we could put down there, discovery of safety requirements. Like there's an accident, you go, well, we got to change to make sure that accident doesn't occur with this unit. So yeah, so that's another consideration. Because it takes so long to build these things, all of these things are in play. Let's go to the next slide. We'll come back to this in the economics part of the course. All right, so here are some examples. Units that what is, the problem is I can't see the bottom here. Which, okay, this is vocal. This just came online. 8 years behind schedule, $21 billion over budget. Now, when you go beyond the time you originally estimated you were going to complete a project, your projected revenue streams become a real problem, because if it was supposed to be completed 8 years ago, they assume it would be producing electricity and they would be getting money coming in. Instead, for 8 more years, money was going out and no money was coming in. The federal government had to step in and give them essentially a loan at probably, I'm guessing, close to 0% or very low. I don't know, maybe it was higher, but it was guaranteed, so that if the project didn't get completed, the U.S. Treasury, the American public, would just pay for it. Now, if you think that that was a remote possibility, there is a plant, AP 1000 plant in South Carolina called PC Summer. That's exactly what happened. They never got done, and the utility went bankrupt, and the ratepayer was holding the bag. So they had to use creative financing to get this thing done. It was $21 billion over budget. That's a lot of money. Let's go to, I think the 2 units came out costing around 35 billion bucks. To give you some idea, admittedly, that was 2.2 gigawatts of electrical capacity. You could probably build a large gas-fired plant in about 4 years or less. Not, I don't know what this thing took. I don't know, it's like 14 years or something. I forget what the number is. I forget when this thing started, but I want to say it was supposed to be done in some time ago. It started, I want to say, around 2009. So, it was a bit more than 4 years. So you could probably do a gas plant for, I want to say, in about 4 years, and it would cost maybe $6 to $8 billion, not 35. Now, admittedly, you'd have gas. You'd have to pay for the gas, but you'd have probably fewer workers, and the gas right now is pretty darn cheap. Has been for quite a while. It's like, I don't know, $3 per million BTU. I mean, it's pretty low. All right, let's go to the next slide. Hinkley C is even worse. This thing is coming in at $43 billion for 3 gigawatts, and it's 14 years behind schedule. I mean, it may grow in cost yet. We'll have to wait and see. Next slide. Flamanville is a French one. It's 400% over budget, 12 years behind. Now, I have picked on advanced Western economies, and the reason why is when you go to Korea and you go to China, you go to Russia, it's kind of a corporatist situation where the government is so heavily involved in the financing. It's very hard to know exactly what things cost. Now, I have to say, they're cheaper, but they tend to slip in time and in original cost estimates as well, not as severely. And I think the reason why is the state is so heavily invested in getting the thing done, and the regulatory systems are not as tough, if you will. But in places where we are comfortable and have pretty good knowledge of the economics, this is the situation. Let's go to the next slide. I'm really beating up on this. This is I was just there. I did not visit this plant, but I did go to Finland this summer, and this was 14 years behind schedule and $7.8 billion. I think the point here is it isn't just U.S. nuclear regulatory rules that are driving these costs up. I mean, these are a lot of different countries. It's not just the U.S. Okay, let's go now. The latest estimates of the levelized cost. The levelized cost is a fancy idea. It just means if you take the lifetime of the plant, the cost to design it, the cost to build it, the cost to finance it, the cost to operate it, the cost to fuel it, the cost to decommission it, and you add all those numbers up, and then you divide by the number of megawatts that it produces over its lifetime, you get a dollar figure. Is this megawatts or kilowatts? I always get that confused. It I think it's, well, I'm going to say it doesn't matter because it does. It's the same number except one order of magnitude. Zero comes off. But you can see that nuclear is not doing very well against its competitors, the large nuclear. The only thing, it's right there with rooftop solar is more expensive, and some gas peaking is more expensive, but everything else is cheaper. And take your pick. I mean, you can be a fossil fuel freak or not. It doesn't matter. So it's not positioned where it should be. And the argument is, let's go to the next slide. Well, I mean, of course, what this has done is reduced the number of large plants being built. There's still large plants being built, mostly in China. There's some, UAE just finished one. Turkey and Egypt are doing plants. Bangladesh, I think India is struggling, but the numbers are down compared to the 80s and 70s. You can see by the red hashes, and that's because the economics just don't look that good. Again, this is bigger than that story about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission driving up costs. This is a global phenomenon, okay, and a global phenomenon that includes the countries that are doing well with building these things, arguably China, arguably Korea. All right, let's go to the next slide.